Hello, phenomenal story lovers. Are you ready for a tale so raw, so emotional, it will redefine everything you thought you knew about healing and second chances? This story will make you believe in the impossible. Before we dive into this gripping narrative, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. And if you believe that even the deepest wounds can heal with the right touch, smash that like button and subscribe for more powerful life-changing stories. Your engagement fuels our work. Get out like all the others. I don't need your pity or your services, David Anderson roared, tossing the job application to the floor. His eyes, bloodshot from another sleepless night, blazed at the woman who stood motionless before his desk. Haven't you heard the stories? The ruthless widower who drives away all his employees? The man who died with his wife but forgot to stop breathing? The office, plunged in shadows despite it being midday, seemed to swallow the little light filtering through the heavy curtains. David ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair, as memories of Sarah assailed him with the same cruelty as always. 362 days without her. A self-imposed hell he neither wanted nor deserved to escape. The young woman before him, Victoria Hayes, calmly picked up the paper from the floor. There was no fear in her eyes, only a serene determination that irritated David even more. "Mr. Anderson, with all due respect, I didn't come out of pity," she replied in a firm voice. "I need the job, and you need a cook. It's a fair exchange, nothing more." David let out a bitter laugh. A fair exchange? Nothing in this life is fair. If it were, Sarah would still be alive, and I wouldn't be here, a shadow of myself, tormenting anyone who dared to approach. He spoke, his voice breaking. "Do you know how many cooks have lasted more than a week in this house since the accident?" He hated that weakness in his voice. "None. Absolutely none." Victoria held his gaze, a silent challenge David hadn't experienced in months. Everyone around him walked on eggshells, afraid of provoking his wrath, or worse, of witnessing the moment his facade of hardness crumbled to reveal the raw pain he hid. "I'll be the first then," she declared, with a confidence that seemed out of place in that mausoleum of memories that was now the Anderson mansion. David studied her more closely. Victoria didn't fit the image he had of someone desperate for a job. Her posture exuded dignity despite the simplicity of her clothes. Her hands, though visibly hard-working, held the paper firmly. And her eyes. There was something about them that disturbed him. It wasn't pity, thank goodness. It was something harder to define, something he had forgotten how to face. Genuine understanding. "Why?" he asked abruptly. "Why bother? There are dozens of places where an experienced cook can work without having to deal with this." He made a vague gesture that encompassed both the disordered office and himself. Victoria took a deep breath before replying, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Because I also know what it's like to lose everything, Mr. Anderson. The difference is I didn't have the luxury of shutting myself away to mourn my loss. I had to keep going." Her words were like a physical punch. David tensed, and for a fleeting instant, a spark of something forgotten, indignation, interest, pierced the fog of his pain. "Don't talk about what you don't understand," he warned in a low, dangerous voice. "You have no idea what I've lost." "No, I don't," she conceded. "Just as you have no idea what I've lost. But here we are, two strangers, each carrying their own weight. The difference is I'm willing to cook for you while you do it." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the accusatory emptiness that usually enveloped him, but something charged with a distinct tension. David found himself speechless, a forgotten sensation for someone who had been, before the tragedy, a feared and respected negotiator in the business world. "What can you cook?" he finally asked, surprising himself. A slight smile, barely visible, softened Victoria's face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of recognition. as if she had identified something in him that even David didn't know still existed. "Anything you need, Mr. Anderson. Specialized in food that nourishes more than just the body." David looked away, uncomfortable with the barely veiled metaphor. "I'm not looking for therapy in a plate of food, Miss Hayes. I'm not offering therapy, Mr. Anderson. Just good food." Their eyes met again, and David felt something stir within him, like debris shifting after being motionless for a long time, revealing that there was still life buried beneath. "You have a week's trial," he said abruptly, standing up to end the conversation. "My housekeeper will show you your room in the kitchen." Victoria nodded, maintaining her composure. "You won't regret it." "I already do," he murmured, as she left the office, but his voice lacked its usual edge. He walked to the window and slightly pulled back the curtain, allowing a ray of sunlight to enter for the first time in months. He watched Victoria as she crossed the neglected garden with old Mrs. Davies, the only one of the original staff who had endured his transformation into a tyrant. David felt the familiar weight of his wedding ring on his finger. He turned it, an unconscious ritual he repeated when he felt threatened. "There's no room for anyone else, Sarah," he whispered to the memory of his wife. "Not after what I did." But something had changed, imperceptible, like the first crack of ice at the beginning of the thaw. In a house where time seemed to have stopped, Victoria's arrival marked the movement of a clock everyone thought was frozen forever. The aroma was the first thing he noticed, a warm, comforting scent that snaked through the mansion's hallways, slipping under his office door, invading the fortress of solitude he had built so meticulously. David looked up from the documents he pretended to review. His stomach reacted with a treacherous growl. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt genuine appetite. The office door opened without the usual pre-announcement that all his employees had learned to give, for fear of his reaction. "Dinner is served, Mr. Anderson," Victoria announced, standing in the doorway with an apron over her simple gray dress. Her face, illuminated by the hallway light, contrasted with the darkness in which he had taken refuge. "I told Mrs. Davies I would dine in here, as always." "Mrs. Davies informed me of your instructions," Victoria replied calmly. "She also told me you haven't used the dining room in 8 months. I think it's time to change that." David looked at her as if she had suggested climbing Mount Everest in his underwear. "Didn't they explain the rules of this house to you? I don't give explanations to my employees. You are the ones who follow my orders." Victoria didn't back down an inch. "With all due respect, sir, the food I've prepared isn't designed to be eaten over work papers. It needs space, proper service, and preferably, someone sitting correctly in front of it. Are you giving me orders in my own house?" David stood up, expecting to intimidate her with his height and sharp tone. "I'm offering to do my job correctly. You can do the same with yours by coming down for dinner, or you can stay here and let the first decent meal prepared in this kitchen in months go to waste. Your choice." The word choice resonated in David's mind. How long had it been since someone presented him with a real option, instead of simply bending to his demands out of fear or pity? Victoria turned halfway, without waiting for a response, leaving the door open. David remained motionless, torn between indignation and a curiosity he thought was extinct. The aroma continued to tempt him, evoking memories of happier times, of shared dinners, of laughter that now seemed to belong to another life. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his feet were already moving towards the door. He stopped in the hallway, listening to the clinking of cutlery coming from the dining room. Something in that everyday sound, almost forgotten, drew him like a magnet. The main dining room, once the scene of lively gatherings and business dinners, seemed like a ghostly stage. The enormous oak table, which could seat 20 diners, was set for only one, at the head. The fine china that Sarah had selected with so much care gleamed under the light of lit chandeliers. A single crystal glass awaited to be filled. Victoria stood by the table, serene and professional, as if serving dinner to a man who had terrorized all his staff was the most natural thing in the world. "Please, sit down," she said softly. "The soup is getting cold." David walked forward like a sleepwalker, stopping when he saw the portrait of Sarah that dominated one of the walls. Her eyes, painted with extraordinary detail, seemed to follow him, questioning. "She was right, you know," he murmured, unaware he had spoken aloud. "Sarah always said I should never build such a large dining room. We'll feel like we're on opposite sides of an ocean," she used to joke. It was just a flicker of vulnerability, but as soon as the words left his lips, David tensed, horrified at having shared that intimate memory. Victoria, however, showed no surprise, nor did she seize the moment to offer empty condolences. "Large spaces can be cozy with the right people," she commented, serving him a steaming broth whose aroma intensified the hunger David had denied for so long. "And lonely, even in the smallest room, when the right person is missing." David looked at her, disconcerted by her response, free of the pity he so detested. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked, abruptly changing the subject as he sat down, uncomfortable, but resigned to the situation. "With my grandmother, mainly," Victoria replied, as she meticulously adjusted the cutlery. "Then at the Soul's Corner restaurant until it closed. Cooking is my way of speaking when words aren't enough." David took the spoon, hesitant. The first sip of the broth made him close his eyes involuntarily. It was as if something inside him, frozen for almost a year, began to slowly melt. "It's acceptable," he mumbled, though both knew it was the best food he had tasted in months. Victoria nodded, showing neither excessive satisfaction nor pride. She simply waited, standing at a respectful distance. "You may leave," David said after a few moments, uncomfortable under her serene gaze. "I don't need you to watch me eat." "As you wish, sir," she replied, heading towards the door. Before leaving, she added, "The second course is ready to be served when you finish the soup. Please let me know when you're ready." David nodded distractedly, concentrating on the comforting taste that now flooded his senses. When he looked up, Victoria was gone, but her presence seemed to linger in the air, like a musical note that continues to vibrate after the instrument has stopped playing. In the solitude of this dining room, facing Sarah's portrait, David felt that the carefully constructed walls of his isolation had suffered their first crack. It wasn't a voluntary opening, but a subtle invasion, through the aroma of homemade soup, through a voice that didn't tremble at his harshness, through eyes that seemed to see beyond his bitter shell. "It won't work, whatever you're trying," he muttered towards his wife's portrait. "There's no turning back after what happened, after what I did." But as he savored each spoonful of that broth, a part of him, buried under layers of guilt and pain, began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there was a different path from perpetual self-punishment. A path that could strangely begin with a simple dinner served by a woman who dared to challenge him in his own home. And that possibility, more than anything else, was what truly terrified him. The following days established a routine that subtly altered the mansion's atmosphere. David remained distant, sometimes cruel with his words, but he no longer spent all his hours locked in his office. Meals became a silent but constant ritual, where Victoria served elaborate dishes that he pretended to receive with indifference. The house staff, temporarily expanded after the numerous resignations of recent months, observed the change with cautious hope. Mrs. Davies, who had witnessed David's descent into the abyss after Sarah's death, was the first to notice how the master began to pay attention to details he had ignored for months. A mention about the neglected garden, a question about pending bills, even a comment that wasn't laden with bitterness. On the 5th day, while Victoria was preparing an apple pie in the mansion's spacious kitchen, David appeared in the doorway. It was the first time he had entered there since the accident. That space had been Sarah's favorite, who, despite her social position, enjoyed cooking for special occasions. Victoria, concentrating on her task, didn't immediately notice his presence. David watched her work, noting the grace of her movements, the precision with which her hands handled the ingredients. There was something hypnotic about watching her create something so simple, yet so meaningful as a dessert. "Sarah also made apple pie," he finally said, startling her. Victoria turned, her hands covered in flour. "I'm sorry, I didn't know that." "It's not a reproach," he clarified, surprising himself with the softness of his tone. "Just an observation." A silence heavy with meaning floated between them. It was the first time David had mentioned his wife voluntarily, without pain immediately coloring his words. "How was hers?" Victoria asked carefully, returning to her task but keeping the conversation going. David leaned against the doorframe, torn between his habit of cutting off any attempt to talk about Sarah and a strange desire to share a memory that, for the first time, wasn't exclusively tinged with loss. "She added cinnamon and nutmeg," he finally replied, his voice barely a whisper. "She said the secret was to balance the sweetness with a touch of unexpected spices. It was perfect." Victoria nodded, absorbing the information without offering comparisons or trivialities. "You can try it that way, if you prefer." David tensed, as if the suggestion were a betrayal of Sarah's memory. "No, make it your way." Another silence ensued, but this one had a different nuance, as if both were navigating unknown waters, seeking a balance between respect for the past and the timid possibility of a different present. "The staff comments that you're looking for a new gardener," Victoria said, as she carefully rolled out the dough. "The garden was beautiful, I've been told. It's a shame to see it so neglected." David frowned, detecting something more than a simple observation. "Do you also have gardening experience, in addition to cooking?" Victoria smiled faintly, without looking away from her work. "No, but I know someone who does. My father has been a gardener his whole life. He's retired now, but I'm sure he knows qualified people." "I don't need family charity, Miss Hayes," David snapped, his tone hardening again. "It's not charity to offer a professional contact, Mr. Anderson," she replied, with the same imperturbable calm that had disarmed him from the first day. "It's simply life, people connecting with other people." David watched her, noticing for the first time details he hadn't allowed himself to fixate on. The determination in her posture, the dignity with which she performed even the most mundane tasks, and above all, the absence of that mix of fear and pity with which everyone had treated him since the tragedy. "Why are you really here?" he asked abruptly. "And don't tell me it's just for the job." Victoria stopped her movements and looked at him directly. "I'm here because we all deserve a second chance, Mr. Anderson, even when we think we don't." The simplicity and depth of her answer left him speechless. "You don't know me," he finally managed to say. "You don't know what I've done." "No, I don't," she conceded. "But I know pain, and I know that sometimes we punish ourselves more cruelly than any external judge." David felt something break inside him, a crack in the wall he had erected between his heart and the world. For a terrifying instant, he was about to tell her everything. The argument with Sarah before the accident, the words he could never retract, the crushing guilt that consumed him every day. But the moment passed, and the wall rebuilt itself. though no longer with the same solidity. "The trial week ends tomorrow," he said, abruptly changing the subject. "You can stay. Your food is acceptable." Victoria nodded, recognizing the compliment hidden behind his abrupt tone. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson." David turned to leave, stopping when she added, "The rose garden needs urgent attention. The plants are still alive beneath all that neglect. They just need someone to believe they're worth saving." He didn't respond, but as he walked away, Victoria's words resonated in his mind, along with the memory of Sarah among those roses, smiling under the summer sun, oblivious to the fate that awaited them and the storm brewing between them. That night, for the first time in months, David allowed himself to open the drawer where he kept the photo albums. Not to torture himself with what was lost, as he occasionally did in his worst moments, but to remember what Sarah had really been like. Not an accusatory ghost, but a woman who had loved life, and who, he was sure, would have detested seeing what he had become. As he turned the pages, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea that, only days ago, he would have rejected as an unforgivable betrayal of his wife's memory. Perhaps, just perhaps, the way to honor Sarah was not to immerse himself in eternal misery, but to find the courage to live again. And perhaps, Victoria's strange and unexpected presence in his house was not a coincidence, but the opportunity he didn't know he needed. A month after Victoria's arrival, the Anderson mansion began to stir from its slumber. The change wasn't obvious to a casual observer, but for those who had lived in that mausoleum of memories, the difference was as remarkable as the first sprout after a long winter. "The master has asked us to clean the main lounges," Mrs. Davies commented as she supervised the morning cleaning, a tremor of emotion in her tired voice. "He says it's time to put them to use." Victoria, busy preparing breakfast, nodded without showing surprise. Unlike the rest of the staff, she had been expecting this moment. She had seen it brewing in the small details. David spending more time out of his office, asking questions about the house's operations, and even, the day before, stopping in front of the rose garden with a thoughtful expression. "Time is helping him heal," she simply replied. Mrs. Davies looked at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "In 2 weeks, you've achieved more than all of us in months. How?" Victoria continued beating the pancake batter with precise, rhythmic movements. "I haven't done anything extraordinary, Mrs. Davies. I've just been persistent." "You've been much more than that, child," the elderly woman replied, lowering her voice. "You've been brave. We were all afraid to face his pain, his anger. You looked him directly in the eye, without flinching." Victoria paused her movements and considered the older woman's words. It was true she hadn't flinched from David's bitterness, but she didn't consider it an act of bravery. For her, there simply was no other way to live. Pain, whether her own or someone else's, doesn't heal by avoiding it. "Every person has their moment to live again," she finally said. Mr. Anderson just needed a reminder that that moment could be now. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the man in question. David entered the kitchen with a determined stride, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, so different from the disheveled appearance he had maintained for almost a year. His beard was trimmed, and his hair, though still long, had regained its shine and order. Mrs. Davies murmured an excuse and discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. "Good morning," he greeted, stopping by the central island of the kitchen. "Smells good." Victoria gave him a brief but genuine smile, the kind of gesture she had earned the right to offer after weeks of meticulously dismantling David's barriers. "Blueberry pancakes. They'll be ready in 5 minutes." David nodded, and then, as if taking a leap of faith, added, "I've decided to host a dinner. This weekend." The news didn't completely surprise Victoria, but the fact that David announced it with such determination was significant. "How many guests?" she asked, keeping the conversation on practical ground. "Around 30 people," he replied. And after a pause loaded with meaning, he added, "Mostly business partners. It's time to resume some responsibilities." What he didn't say, but both understood, was that this dinner represented his first real step back into the outside world after months of self-imposed exile. "I'll prepare a menu for your approval this afternoon," Victoria offered, skillfully flipping a golden pancake. David watched her work, noting the grace of her movements, the concentration on her face. Something about that dedication was endearingly familiar and, at the same time, completely new. "In fact," he finally said, "there's another matter I wanted to discuss with you." Victoria looked at him, intrigued by the cautious tone in his voice. "I would like you to attend the dinner, not as part of the staff, but as a guest." The surprise made Victoria almost drop the spatula. Of all the evolutions she had witnessed in David during these weeks, this invitation was perhaps the most unexpected. "Mr. Anderson, I believe," he interrupted her, "that at least in private, we could drop the formalities." The change was as significant as the invitation itself. For weeks, despite the growing comfort between them, he had maintained the distance that his position as employer dictated. "David," she repeated, savoring the strange intimacy that the use of his first name created. "I don't think it would be appropriate for me to mix with your guests. They are important people, and I am someone he respects," he completed, "and to whom I owe more than I can express." Victoria felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at those words. In the month she had been working at the mansion, she had learned to interpret David's silences, to read between the lines of his curt phrases. But this direct acknowledgement was something completely new. "You don't owe me anything," she replied softly. "I owe you the possibility of seeing beyond the pain," he said, with an honesty that surprised both of them. "And I want you to be there when I take this first step." The vulnerability in his request was impossible to ignore. It wasn't an order from her boss. It was almost a plea from a man who, after months of isolation, was facing the world again and seeking a foothold, a friendly face in the crowd. "All right," she finally conceded. "I will attend." The relief on David's face was as evident as it was fleeting, quickly masked by his usual composure. "Excellent," he replied, regaining his formal tone. "Mrs. Davies will make sure you have what you need. If you need an appropriate dress or anything else, tell her to arrange it." Victoria nodded, aware that this offer was not a matter of charity, but of practicality. Both knew that her modest wardrobe did not include outfits for a formal dinner with the business elite. "Thank you," she simply said, serving the pancakes onto a plate. "Although I'll have to rearrange my duties for that day, I can't be a cook and a guest simultaneously." A shadow of a smile, the first Victoria had seen on him, briefly appeared on David's face. "I understand that the restaurant where you worked closed. Is the chef still in the city?" The keenness of the question showed that David had been paying more attention than he let on during their conversations. "Yes, Manuel is giving private classes while looking for a new place," she confirmed. "Contact him," David instructed. "Offer him double his usual rate to take care of the menu that day. Under your supervision, of course." Victoria couldn't help but smile fully this time. "You trust me to make that decision?" "I trust your judgment more than my own right now," he admitted, with a frankness that hinted at how much things had changed between them. Breakfast continued in a comfortable silence, so different from the tension that had characterized their first encounters. When David finally excused himself to take some business calls, another sign of his gradual return to life, Victoria found herself contemplating her own reflection in the gleaming surface of the stove. The woman looking back at her was the same one who had arrived at this mansion a month ago, determined to get a desperately needed job. And yet, something had changed. A sparkle in her eyes, a softness in her expression that wasn't there before. "Be careful," she warned herself. "You're not here to save him, and you're definitely not here to fall in love." But as she cleared the breakfast dishes, a part of her wondered if it wasn't already too late for both. The day of the dinner arrived with a renewed energy that could be felt in every corner of the mansion. The staff, temporarily expanded for the occasion, moved with an enthusiasm that reflected the importance of the event. For all of them, this night marked David Anderson's official return to the world. Victoria supervised the culinary preparations throughout the morning, working side by side with Manuel, her former boss, who had gladly accepted the generous offer. The menu, sophisticated, yet with comforting touches that she had insisted on keeping, promised to impress even the most demanding palates. "I never thought I'd see you in a place like this," Manuel commented as he put the finishing touches on a sauce. "What's it like working for the ruthless widower?" The question, though lightly phrased, touched a sensitive point. Victoria tensed imperceptibly. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear," she replied carefully. "People are always more complex than the rumors about them." Manuel looked at her with curiosity. "You've grown fond of him," he observed, without malice, but with obvious surprise. "I've come to respect him," she corrected, though the distinction seemed increasingly blurred even to herself. By mid-afternoon, satisfied that everything was on track, Victoria retired to her room to prepare. On the bed rested a large box that hadn't been there that morning. A simple card accompanied it, with David's unmistakable elegant handwriting. A suggestion, not an imposition. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, Victoria lifted the lid. The dress she found inside drew an involuntary gasp. It was a deep blue, almost like the midnight ocean, with a classic cut that promised elegance without ostentation. The fabric, a soft satin, seemed to flow like water through her fingers. Alongside the dress, a smaller box contained a simple but beautiful silver necklace with a single sapphire that matched the dress's color. The generosity of the gesture moved and worried her in equal measure. She didn't want to misinterpret the meaning of this gift, nor allow others to do so. However, the delicacy with which it had been chosen, nothing excessively luxurious or flashy, but something that reflected her own personality, suggested an understanding of her that went beyond the employer-employee relationship. After a moment of hesitation, Victoria decided to accept the gift in the spirit she believed it had been offered, as a gesture of gratitude and respect, not as an attempt to transform her into something she wasn't. When she finally looked in the mirror, fully dressed, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The dress fit her figure perfectly, enhancing her natural grace without being ostentatious. She had tied her hair in a simple but elegant bun, letting some strands frame her face. Her discreet makeup highlighted the depth of her eyes and the softness of her lips. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would have been like to grow up in a world where dresses like this and social events were part of her daily life, instead of the constant struggle she had known. But she quickly dismissed that thought. Every step of her journey, every difficulty overcome, had made her who she was. And that woman, regardless of the dress she wore tonight, was still Victoria Hayes, a gardener's daughter and a cook by vocation. With that renewed certainty, she headed towards the grand hall, where the murmur of early conversations and the soft clinking of crystal glasses could already be heard. David waited in the foyer, nervously checking his watch. Although outwardly he projected the confidence that had been his hallmark for years in the business world, inwardly he felt an anxiety he hadn't experienced in a long time. Tonight represented much more than a simple social gathering. It was his formal declaration that life continued, that he was ready to take back control of his existence. When he looked up and saw Victoria descending the staircase, something stopped in his chest. The blue dress he had chosen for her, with the discreet help of Mrs. Davies, seemed to have been created specifically to enhance her natural beauty. It wasn't a conventional, dazzling beauty like those that usually adorned high society events, but something deeper and more authentic. "This," he began, searching for the right word as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Perfect." Victoria smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you for the dress and the necklace," she said sincerely. "It wasn't necessary, but I appreciate it." "On the contrary," he replied. "It was the least I could offer, considering what you've done for this house. For me." The atmosphere between them became charged with a different energy, something that went beyond the words exchanged. For an instant, David felt the urge to extend his hand towards her, to touch her somehow to make sure she was real, that she wouldn't disappear like so many good things in his life. The moment was broken by the arrival of the first guests. The butler announced an elegant couple, and David instantly regained his host's composure. "Ready?" he asked softly. Victoria nodded, slightly shrugging her shoulders. "As ready as one can be to jump into the void," she quipped, though there was a genuine touch of nervousness in her voice. "Don't worry," he reassured her. "I'll be by your side most of the night." The phrase, spoken so naturally, contained a promise that went beyond the evening, and both knew it. As the main hall filled with guests, David's transformation was evident to those who had known him before his self-imposed retirement. While there were still shadows in his eyes, a gravity that wasn't present before the tragedy, he moved with the natural confidence and authority that had characterized him in his best times. Many guests, especially those who had unsuccessfully tried to contact him for months, offered belated condolences mixed with obvious attempts to re-establish business connections. David accepted them with polite coolness, clearly unwilling to turn the night into a constant reminder of his loss. Victoria observed his interactions from a safe distance, impressed by his ability to navigate social complexities despite his time away. When a guest approached her, generally assuming she was a friend or distant relative of David's, she responded politely, but with deliberate vagueness. "I work with Miss Anderson," was her standard reply, without going into details about the exact nature of that work. As the evening progressed and dinner was served, Victoria noticed how some curious eyes followed her movements and interactions with David. In particular, an elegant middle-aged woman, who had been introduced as an important shareholder, studied her with particular interest. "So you're the famous Victoria," the woman said, approaching during a moment when David had been cornered by a group of partners. "I must say you've achieved what many considered impossible." Victoria looked at her cautiously, not fully understanding what she meant. "I'm not sure I understand," the woman smiled, a calculated gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "Bringing David back to the land of the living, dear. Rumors of your transformation have been circulating for weeks. Many bet he'd never get over Sarah's death, especially considering the circumstances." The insinuating tone with which she uttered the last words put Victoria on alert. It was clear that this woman knew, or thought she knew, something specific about the accident that had cost Sarah her life. "Mr. Anderson has decided to resume his activities on his own," she replied carefully. "I've simply had the privilege of witnessing that process." "How charmingly modest," the woman retorted with a smile that now seemed more genuine. "Sarah would have approved of your discretion. She also understood the value of silent loyalty." Before Victoria could reply, The woman was called away by another group, leaving her with an uncomfortable feeling and more questions than answers. What did this woman know about David and Sarah's relationship? What circumstances had she mentioned with such insinuation? She didn't have time to reflect too much, as dinner was announced, and all the guests headed to the main dining room, transformed for the occasion into a space that balanced elegance and warmth. Conversations flowed, wine poured generously, and the food, supervised by Victoria but executed by Manuel, received unanimous praise. David, seated at the head of the table, seemed more relaxed as the night progressed. Occasionally his eyes sought out Victoria, strategically seated halfway down the table, as if to ensure she was still there, or perhaps seeking in her the strength to continue his role as host. It was during dessert when Marcus Bell, an attractive businessman, known for both his commercial successes and his romantic conquests, began to pay particular attention to Victoria. "I don't recall seeing you in David's circle before," he commented, leaning towards her with a charming smile. "And believe me, I would remember a face like yours." Victoria maintained her composure, accustomed to dealing with direct compliments during her years working at the restaurant. "It's my first time at one of these events," she replied politely, revealing nothing more. "Well, I hope it's not your last," Marcus said, his appreciative gaze discreetly sweeping over her elegant blue dress. "In fact, I've noticed that David seems much more alive since you came into his life. It's refreshing to see him like this after so long." The familiarity with which he spoke of his relationship with David surprised her. "Have you known him long?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Since university," Marcus nodded. "We've been friends and occasional competitors for over a decade. I know David better than most. I even knew Sarah before him." This revelation further piqued Victoria's interest. Here was someone who could offer her insight into David before the tragedy, a piece of the puzzle she was trying to understand. "It must have been difficult to see him suffer after the accident," she commented cautiously. A flicker of something, sadness, guilt, crossed Marcus's eyes, disappearing so quickly Victoria doubted she had seen it. "More than you can imagine," he replied softly. "David and I have had our differences, but seeing him destroy himself was painful for all of us who cared about him." The conversation was interrupted on the announcement that the after-dinner drinks would continue in the main lounge, where a dance area had been set up, and a small orchestra began to play soft music. As the guests stood up and headed towards the lounge, Marcus offered Victoria his arm with a chivalrous gesture. "Would you grant me the honor of accompanying you?" he asked, with a smile that had conquered countless women. Victoria hesitated for an instant, aware of David's gaze following her movements from the other end of the table, but refusing the gesture would have seemed impolite, especially coming from a close friend of her host. "Of course," she finally accepted, placing her hand lightly on the offered arm. In the lounge, the orchestra was now playing a classic waltz. Some couples were already gliding across the floor, while other guests chatted in small groups, glasses in hand. David moved among them, the perfect image of the attentive host, though Victoria noticed how his gaze periodically sought her out. "Would you like to dance?" Marcus asked, leaning slightly towards her. The proposition took her by surprise. She had learned the basics of formal dancing through community classes in her youth, but had never practiced in an environment like this. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she replied honestly. "My dancing skills are limited." Marcus smiled, a gesture that combined charm and confidence. "There's no better way to improve than by practicing," he insisted, extending his hand towards her. "I promise to guide you carefully." Victoria looked around, instinctively searching for David. She found him watching them intently from across the room, an indecipherable expression on his face. Something in that look prompted her to accept Marcus's invitation. Perhaps it was the desire to show that she could integrate into this world that was not her own, or perhaps the curiosity to see how David would react. "All right," she finally agreed, placing her hand in Marcus's. "But be warned, your feet are in danger." Marcus let out a warm, genuine laugh as he led her to the dance floor. "It's a risk I'm willing to take." The music enveloped the couple as Marcus guided Victoria with an expertise that made even the most complex steps seem simple. To her surprise, her body remembered more from those community classes than she had thought. Soon, she found herself moving gracefully, following the rhythm with growing confidence. "You're doing wonderfully," Marcus murmured in her ear as he guided her in an elegant turn. A natural beauty in every sense. The compliment, though gallant, caused an uncomfortable feeling of exposure in Victoria. She was aware of the glances following their movements, of the speculative whispers that her presence at the party had generated throughout the night. And more than anything, she was painfully aware of David's gaze, which had not left the couple since they began to dance. Even while attending to his other guests, his eyes constantly returned to her and Marcus, with an intensity that seemed to increase with each turn of the waltz. "Your friend doesn't seem to approve of our dance," Victoria commented, trying to keep her tone light. Marcus followed the direction of her gaze, and a knowing smile appeared on his lips. "David has always been possessive of what he considers valuable," he replied, pulling her slightly closer than the dance required. "And you, Victoria, are undoubtedly the most precious treasure he has found in a long time." Before she could respond to this disconcerting declaration, Victoria felt a presence beside her. David was there, his face a mask of courtesy that barely concealed the storm beneath. "Marcus," he said, in a controlled voice that held a perceptible edge, "would you allow me to cut in?" Although phrased as a question, there was no doubt it was an order. Marcus, far from appearing offended, smiled with what seemed like secret satisfaction, as if he had provoked exactly the reaction he expected. "Of course, my friend," he replied, separating from Victoria with an elegant step back. "Though I must say, your employee is an exceptional dance partner, almost as exceptional as her beauty tonight." The emphasis on the word employee was subtle, but unmistakable. A small jab that did not go unnoticed by any of the three. David visibly clenched his jaw, but maintained his composure. With a calculatedly casual gesture, he took Victoria's hand and placed it on his arm. "If you'll excuse us," he said to Marcus, not really expecting a reply. "I need to speak with Victoria for a moment." Without waiting for a response, David led her away from the dance floor, through groups of guests who watched them with barely disguised curiosity, until they reached a small terrace adjacent to the main lounge. The fresh night air was a relief after the heat and tension inside. Once alone, David released her arm and walked to the stone balustrade, his back to her, as he seemed to struggle to regain control of his emotions. "I shouldn't have let you dance with him," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of the music. Victoria approached, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Why? Is he your friend?" David turned to her, and the intensity in his eyes made Victoria hold her breath. "Marcus and I have a complicated history," he replied. "He's not someone I completely trust, especially when it comes to the women in my life." The phrase hung between them, loaded with implications neither was prepared to address directly. "I'm not a woman in your life in that sense, David," Victoria said softly. "I'm your employee," as he so kindly pointed out. David took a step towards her, narrowing the distance between them. "Is that all you are to me, Victoria?" he asked, with a vulnerability that contrasted dramatically with his usual reserve. "Just someone who works for me?" Victoria's heart raced. They were entering dangerous territory, one she had consciously tried to avoid since she began to notice the changes in their relationship. "David, Seeing how he looked at you, how he held you while you danced, he continued, not letting her finish. I felt something I haven't experienced in years, something I thought died with Sarah. His words hung in the night air, a confession that changed everything between them. Jealousy, he finally said, as if the word itself were a revelation. I felt jealous, Victoria, and that terrifies me more than anything else. Victoria looked at him, unable to hide the shock on her face. It wasn't just the admission of jealousy that surprised her, but the raw honesty, the complete vulnerability with which David exposed himself to her. "Why does it terrify you?" she asked in a whisper. David took another step closer, now so near that she could discern the slight tremble in his hands, the internal struggle reflected in his eyes. "Because it means you matter to me," he replied, his voice breaking. "And it means I'm betraying her memory." A silence laden with emotions settled between them. Victoria could feel the warmth emanating from David's body, so close to hers, as she tried to process his words. "Sarah's memory doesn't require you to deny yourself life, David," she finally said, softly but firmly. "No, true love would demand such a sacrifice." David looked away, a storm of emotions crossing his face. "You don't understand," he murmured. "It's not that simple." "Then help me understand," she replied, risking a gentle touch on his arm. "What really happened with Sarah? Why do you blame yourself so much?" The question hung between them, as heavy and tangible as the night air. For a moment, Victoria feared she had crossed a line, had pushed too soon. But to her surprise, David didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "We argued," he finally confessed, each word seemingly torn painfully from within him. "The night of the accident. It was the worst fight we'd ever had." Victoria waited in silence, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "She suspected I was having an affair with a business partner's wife," he continued, his words now flowing as if a floodgate had opened. "It wasn't true, but appearances. We had been seen together several times, always for business, but the rumors started." He paused, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I said terrible things to her, Victoria, things I didn't truly mean, but that I knew would hurt her. I was furious that she doubted me, proud, arrogant, unable to understand her fear, her insecurity." His voice broke, and Victoria saw the gleam of suppressed tears in his eyes. She left the house that night, furious, hurt, driving in the rain, distressed by my words. And then, he stopped, unable to continue. "The accident," Victoria completed softly. David nodded, the pain so evident on his face that it seemed almost physical. "The last words I said to her were in anger," he whispered, "and now I can never take them back. I can never ask for her forgiveness. And every time I feel something akin to happiness, every time for a moment I forget, the guilt returns like a tide." Victoria then understood the magnitude of the torment David had been carrying. It wasn't just the pain of losing Sarah, but the crushing weight of guilt, the belief that his words had directly contributed to her death. With a deliberate movement, she took David's hands in hers. "I can't imagine what you've been through," she said sincerely. "But I know enough about love to know this. Sarah wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. True love doesn't seek eternal suffering as penance." David looked at her, an almost childlike vulnerability in his eyes. "How can you be so sure?" "Because if she loved you enough to be so hurt by the possibility of losing you," Victoria replied, "then she loved you enough to want your happiness, even after her passing." Something in her words seemed to reach a part of David that had remained closed, inaccessible even to himself. His shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a fraction of the weight he carried had been lifted. "I've been so lost," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "And then you arrived, and for the first time in almost a year, I could see a path forward, a future that wasn't just existing in this limbo of guilt and pain." The words resonated in Victoria's heart with an intensity that frightened her. She had come to this house simply looking for a job, a way to stay afloat financially. She had never imagined becoming the anchor of salvation for such a deeply wounded man. "David, But before she could complete her thought, the terrace door opened, and Marcus Bell's silhouette was outlined against the light emanating from the lounge. "Ah, here you are," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your guests are wondering where their host is, David, and some are especially curious about the nature of your private conversation." The intimacy of the moment shattered, and David pulled away from Victoria, instantly regaining his mask of control. However, Victoria noticed that he didn't completely let go of her hand, maintaining a subtle but deliberate contact. "We'll be back in a moment," David replied, his voice regaining the tone of authority that characterized him in the business world. Marcus observed the point where their hands touched, an indefinable expression crossing his face. "Just a friendly warning, old friend," he said, his casual tone contrasting with the intensity of his gaze. "People talk, and you know how those conversations can be. Destructive." The veiled threat made David visibly tense. Victoria felt his fingers clench against hers. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus," David replied, with a coldness Victoria had never heard from him before. "But what I do or don't do in my own home stopped being anyone else's business a long time ago." Marcus smiled, a gesture that looked more like a calculated sneer. "As you say, I just hope Victoria understands what she's getting herself into," he said, giving her a look that mixed warning and something darker. "Sarah's shadow is long. Ask David. He knows better than anyone." With those words, Marcus turned and returned to the lounge, leaving them alone again, but with the magic of the previous moment irrevocably broken. David let out a deep sigh, running his free hand over his face with a tired gesture. "We must go back," he said, though it was evident he would rather be anywhere else. "It's not appropriate to prolong our absence." Victoria nodded, aware of the complexity of the situation. What had just occurred between them, the truths revealed, the emotions exposed, would need time and space to be properly processed, and a party full of watchful eyes and sharp tongues was not the place for it. "Of course," she replied, lightly squeezing his hand before letting go. "Your guests await you." David looked at her for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the right words. Finally, he offered her his arm with a formal gesture that contrasted with the intimacy they had shared minutes before. "Miss Hayes, would you do me the honor?" Victoria accepted the offered arm, feeling the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of his suit. "The honor is mine, Mr. Anderson," she replied, adopting the same formal tone, but with a smile that communicated much more. Together, they returned to the lounge where the party continued. The guests observed them with barely disguised curiosity, but something had changed in David. The tension that had characterized his posture throughout the night seemed to have eased slightly, and when his eyes met Victoria's across the room, there was a new light in them, a glimmer of hope, where before only resignation had existed. The night continued its course, with David impeccably fulfilling his role as host. But for those who knew him well, it was evident that something fundamental had changed in him. And for Victoria, who was just beginning to understand the depth of the transformation they were both experiencing, each shared glance with David seemed to contain a silent promise, a possible future that only hours before would have seemed unthinkable. As the orchestra played a soft melody and guests began to say their goodbyes, Victoria found herself watching David from a distance, aware that the true storm was just beginning. The jealousy David had shown tonight was only the surface of a much deeper sea of repressed emotions, unresolved guilt and terrifying possibilities. And in the center of that storm was she, a woman who had come simply looking for a job, and who now found herself holding something much more fragile and valuable in her hands, the newly awakened heart of a man who had believed he could no longer feel. The question floating in her mind as the night came to an end was as simple as it was terrifying. Was she ready for what would come next? The last guest said goodbye after midnight, leaving behind echoes of conversations and the subtle perfume of flowers mixed with champagne. The Anderson mansion, which had so long been plunged into silence and shadows, seemed to breathe again, as if the very building had awakened along with its owner. Victoria supervised the temporary staff as they collected the last glasses and rearranged the furniture. Her fingers idly brushed the sapphire necklace David had given her as her mind replayed the events of the night, especially that moment on the terrace when he had opened his heart, revealing the weight of guilt he had carried since Sarah's death. "Leave it," a voice said behind her, startling her. "The rest can wait until tomorrow." David had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie, a small but significant gesture of relaxation he rarely allowed himself. His eyes reflected exhaustion, but also something else, a calm Victoria hadn't seen in him until tonight. "It was a success," she commented, turning to face him. "Impressed, relieved, or disappointed, depending on their interests," David replied with a slight ironic smile. "But yes, I think it was necessary." A comfortable silence settled between them, so different from the tense voids that characterized their first interactions. Now they seemed like two people who had weathered a storm together and reached the shore, exhausted but united by the shared experience. "About what we talked about on the terrace," David began, his voice softer than usual. Victoria lightly raised her hand, stopping him. "You don't have to explain anything else tonight," she said gently. "It's been a long day for both of us." David nodded, grateful for her understanding, but something in his posture indicated that he needed to continue, that the words had accumulated too long within him to be contained again. "For almost a year, I believed I deserved no peace," he confessed, taking a step closer to her. "That my punishment for the last words I said to Sarah should be a life of solitude and self-loathing." Victoria remained still, allowing him to express himself at his own pace. "But tonight, when I saw you dance with Marcus," he continued, an unusual vulnerability in his voice, "when I felt that jealousy, that fear of losing you before I even had you, I understood something I had been denying." He paused, his eyes searching Victoria's, as if in them he could find the courage to continue. "I understood that life goes on, Victoria, no matter how much we try to stop it, no matter how much guilt we feel for still breathing when someone we love can no longer do so. And you," his voice broke slightly, "you have shown me that perhaps, just perhaps, I deserve a second chance." The words hung between them, as fragile and powerful as freshly formed crystal. Victoria felt her heart race, aware that they were at a turning point. "We all deserve second chances, David," she finally replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Even those who think they don't deserve them." A glimmer of hope illuminated David's eyes, so intense that for a moment it seemed to completely transform his features, restoring a youth and vitality that pain had stolen. "Would you like one last glass of champagne?" he asked, gesturing towards the garden illuminated by lanterns. "The night is too beautiful to waste." Victoria knew she should decline, that the line between employer and employee, already blurred throughout the evening, would blur even further with each minute they spent alone. But something in the way David looked at her, with a mixture of vulnerability and hope, made it impossible for her to refuse the invitation. "I'd love to," she replied, surprised by the softness of her own voice. The garden, though still showing signs of neglect, had begun to recover some of its former glory. Several gardeners had worked during the week leading up to the party, removing weeds and restoring the stone paths. The central fountain, silent for months, now murmured softly under the moon's silver light. David led her to a small gazebo covered in climbing plants, an intimate corner that seemed to exist in its own universe, set apart from the rest of the world. 2 glasses and a bottle of champagne waited there, as if this moment had been planned. "Did you know we'd come here?" Victoria asked, genuinely surprised. David smiled, a gesture that completely transformed his face, making him look years younger. "I hoped," he admitted, uncorking the bottle with expert precision. "Though I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to ask you." He poured the golden champagne into the delicate crystal glasses and offered one to Victoria. "To second chances," he proposed, raising his glass in a toast. "To second chances," she repeated, moved by the sincerity in his voice. The crystal clinked softly in the silence of the night. They drank unhurriedly, contemplating the garden bathed in moonlight. It was a moment of perfect serenity, as if time had stopped to allow them this interlude of peace. "This place was Sarah's favorite," David said after a moment. But to Victoria's surprise, there was no pain in his voice, only a quiet nostalgia. "She spent hours here, reading or simply contemplating the roses." Victoria watched his face, looking for signs of the torturous guilt she had seen before. In its place, she found an expression of peaceful remembrance, as if for the first time he could think of his wife without remorse eclipsing the happy moments. "She must have been an extraordinary woman," she commented sincerely. "She was," David nodded. "Passionate, intelligent, with an ability to see beauty in the simplest things that I never had. She was always a better person than me." He paused, contemplating the garden with a thoughtful expression. "That's why it was so hard for me to accept that I could feel something again," he continued. "It seemed like a betrayal of her memory. But tonight I understood something important." He turned to look directly at Victoria, his eyes reflecting the moon's silver light. "Sarah would have been the first to tell me to move on. That love is not something that runs out or is betrayed by sharing it again. That, in fact, we honor those we lose best when we find the courage to live fully again." Victoria felt her heart expand at these words. During the month she had been in the mansion, she had seen David gradually transform. But this acceptance, this reconciliation with his past, represented the most profound change. "It's a difficult wisdom to attain," she said softly. "And I wouldn't have found it without you," he replied, taking a step closer. The proximity between them shifted subtly, becoming charged with a different tension. It wasn't the sharp tension of conflict or distrust, but the kind that arises when 2 people simultaneously recognize the possibility floating between them. "Victoria," David murmured, his voice barely audible over the soft murmur of the fountain. "A month ago, when you entered my office, you saw me as I really was, a broken man, bitter, lost in his own pain. And yet, you decided to stay." She nodded, remembering that first day, the fury and pain in David's eyes, so different from the warmth she saw now. "I saw someone who needed help, even if he didn't know how to ask for it," she replied simply. "And I also saw something more, something that perhaps even you didn't see then." "What did you see?" he asked. Genuinely curious, Victoria smiled, lightly raising a hand to brush David's cheek in a gesture as natural as it was unexpected for both of them. "I saw the possibility of healing," she replied. "I saw a man who, beneath all that pain and guilt, still had a heart capable of loving again." David closed his eyes at the contact, as if absorbing every word, every sensation. "I'm scared," he confessed, with a vulnerability that the David Anderson of a month ago would never have shown. "Scared of failing again, of not being worthy of this second chance." "Fear is part of living, David," Victoria replied. "We can't avoid it. We can only decide whether it will paralyze us or if we will face it every day." Gently, David took Victoria's hand, which still rested on his cheek, and brought it to his lips in a gesture of infinite tenderness. "I would like to face it with you, if you'll allow me." The words, simple yet loaded with meaning, hung between them like a promise. Victoria felt something unfolding within her, a certainty she had tried to deny since she began to notice the changes in David, since she began to see the man behind the pain. "David, But before she could complete her reply, a distant thunder rumbled in the sky, followed by the first drops of rain. Both looked up, surprised by the sudden change in weather. "Looks like the weather has its own sense of dramatic timing," David commented with a smile as the rain began to intensify. "We should go inside." But Victoria didn't move. Something about the situation seemed perfectly appropriate. The rain, which had been present in the tragedy that changed David's life, now also marked the beginning of something new. "Would you mind if we stay for a moment?" she asked, lifting her face to the drops that fell with increasing intensity. "I've always loved the rain." David looked at her in astonishment, as if witnessing a small but significant miracle. "Sarah also loved the rain," he said softly. "She used to say it was the sky's way of washing the world, to give it a new beginning." The coincidence didn't seem accidental, but full of meaning, as if the universe itself was closing a circle, offering a sign of approval. The rain poured down, soaking both of them in a matter of seconds. Water streamed down Victoria's face, mixing with tears she hadn't even noticed she was shedding. They weren't tears of sadness, but of an emotion so intense and pure that it found no other way to express itself. David watched her with a look of awe, as if witnessing something precious and fragile. "You are extraordinary, Victoria Hayes," he murmured, moving closer until only a few centimeters separated them. "You've brought light to a life I thought was condemned to darkness." With infinite gentleness, he took her face in his hands. The rain fell on both of them, but neither seemed to notice. The entire world had shrunk to that moment, to that space between them that slowly narrowed. "May I kiss you?" he asked with a mixture of hope and fear, like a man who, after a long winter, glimpses the first ray of spring sun. For all response, Victoria closed the distance between them, uniting their lips in a kiss as soft as the rain falling on them. A kiss that tasted of champagne and promises, of past pain and future hope. A kiss that sealed a silent pact, to walk together from that moment on, whatever challenges might come. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, as if they had run a great distance or climbed an impossible mountain. "This changes everything," David whispered, his forehead resting against hers, his hand still cradling her face as if it were the most precious of treasures. "Some things change," Victoria agreed. "Others simply reveal themselves for what they always were." The rain began to ease, as if, having fulfilled its purpose, it discreetly withdrew to leave them alone with this newborn moment. "We need to talk about many things," David said, aware of the complexities they would face. "Your work here, what others will say, how we want to move forward, and we will talk," she assured him, placing a finger on his lips. But not tonight. Tonight is just for us, for this beginning. David smiled, a full and genuine smile that transformed his face, restoring a youth and vitality that pain had stolen. I never thought I'd feel this again, he confessed, intertwining his fingers with hers. This hope. Together, soaked but inexplicably light, they walked back towards the mansion. The house that had once been a mausoleum of painful memories now seemed a cozy refuge, a place where the past could coexist peacefully with the present, where memories could be honored without eclipsing the possibility of new joys. 6 months later, the Anderson mansion garden had fully recovered its splendor. The roses, carefully pruned and nourished, bloomed with an exuberance that seemed almost impossible after such a long time of neglect. New gardeners, recommended by Victoria's father, had transformed what was once a reflection of David's pain into a testament to renewal and care. Victoria contemplated the result from the terrace, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The gentle morning breeze played with her hair, now a little longer than when she arrived at this house as just another employee. So much had changed in these past few months. After that night in the rain, after many honest and some difficult conversations, they had decided to transform their relationship. Victoria had left her position as the mansion's cook, although she occasionally still prepared special dishes for David, and had started her own culinary consulting business. Something she had always dreamed of doing. David had supported her unconditionally, not with his money, which she had refused to accept, but with contacts and opportunities that allowed her to quickly establish herself. Her first big client had been the charitable foundation David had created in honor of Sarah, providing culinary training to young people from vulnerable communities. Their relationship had developed at a pace that respected David's past and Victoria's independence. They went out to dinner, attended events together, traveled occasionally, building new memories while honoring the old ones. To Victoria's surprise, the scandal some had predicted never truly materialized. The people who truly mattered, like the loyal Mrs. Davies, had welcomed their relationship with a warmth that reflected how much they appreciated the change in David. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her reflections. David approached with a smile, dressed casually in jeans and a simple shirt, so different from the rigid, formal man she had initially met. "Good morning, beautiful," he greeted, leaning in to kiss her softly. "You're up early. I wanted to see the sunrise over the roses," she replied, returning his kiss. "They're more beautiful than ever." David observed the garden with a serene expression, free from the pain that used to engulf him when he looked at Sarah's favorite spots. "She would be pleased," he said softly. "She always said that a garden reflects the soul of those who inhabit it." Victoria rested her head on David's shoulder, moved as always by the way he could now speak of his wife with love and nostalgia, but without the destructive guilt that had once consumed him. "And now it reflects healing," she commented. "New growth over deep roots." David smiled, appreciating the metaphor. He put an arm around Victoria's waist, pulling her closer. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his jeans pocket. "Something I've wanted to give you for a while, but I was waiting for the perfect moment." Victoria looked at the box in surprise, her heart racing. "David, it's not what you think," he quickly clarified, with an enigmatic smile. "Or perhaps it is." "Partially." He opened the box, revealing a delicate silver keychain in the shape of a rose, from which 2 keys hung. "The first is for the mansion," he explained, "because I want you to know that this is your home, whenever you wish." Victoria took the keychain with trembling hands, moved by the gesture and its meaning. "And the second?" she asked, noticing it was different. David's smile widened, mixing emotion and nervousness. "It's the key to a small house by the sea, an hour from here," he replied. "A new place, without ghosts or painful memories. A place where we can create our own memories, at our own pace." The significance of the gesture left Victoria speechless. It wasn't a marriage proposal, not yet. It was something equally profound, but more appropriate for where they were. A commitment to their shared future, an acknowledgement that both needed to honor the past and create something completely new. "It's perfect," she finally managed to say, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Absolutely perfect." David took her hands in his expression becoming more serious, but no less loving. "There's something else I want to tell you," he continued. "Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I wanted to be sure it was real. That it wasn't just gratitude or the excitement of feeling something again after so long dormant." He paused, as if gathering the courage for the words that would follow. "I love you, Victoria Hayes," he finally said, each word pronounced with absolute conviction. "I love you for your strength, for your compassion, for the way you see the best in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. I love you for finding me when I was lost, and for helping me find myself again." Tears streamed freely down Victoria's cheeks now, tears of a joy so pure it almost hurt. "I love you too, David Anderson," she replied, her voice broken with emotion. "I love you for your courage, for your ability to heal, for the incredible man you are and always were, even in your darkest moments." They kissed under the rising sun, surrounded by the scent of freshly bloomed roses, with the jingle of keys in their intertwined hands, a tangible symbol of a future that once seemed impossible. Neither of them could know what challenges that future would hold. The path of love is never completely smooth or predictable, but both knew, with a certainty born of having faced their own demons and emerged victorious, that they would walk it together. David looked one last time at the garden before entering the house, his arm firmly around Victoria. Among the roses, he thought he saw for an instant Sarah's smiling face, not as an accusatory ghost, but as a benevolent presence that could finally rest in peace, knowing that he had found his way back to life. "Thank you," he thought, though he wasn't sure if he was thanking Sarah, destiny, or the storm that had prevented Victoria from leaving that first day. Perhaps all three, because sometimes the most unexpected storms lead us exactly where we need to be. And sometimes a simple dance can unleash the jealousy that allows us to recognize what our heart already knows, that love, when true, deserves a second chance.